Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 7 of the Lodgge podcast. I am your host, Scott Milley, and I am very excited to introduce our new, very special guest, Graham Smith. Graham, how are you doing today?
Pretty good. Thanks for having me, Scott.
Of course. Graham is the co-founder of Drinkbox Studios, one of gaming's indie darlings. With success of Guacamelee 1 and 2, and most recently the brand new hit Nobody Saves the World, Drinkbox has carved out a unique space in the industry and a reputation for innovative gameplay, sharp and timeless art direction, and experiences that you simply can't find anywhere else. So today we're going to be talking about Graham's experience in the industry, the Drinkbox story, and of course, Nobody Saves the World. So, without further ado, let's get into the conversation. So, Graham, the first thing I want to ask you about today is just a little fun question to kind of get us started.
Okay.
So, obviously, you're one of the busiest people I know. What are your ideal gaming conditions? Obviously, with friends and family and all these other things going on, anytime that we can get into a game, we do. That's the Switch, handhelds, cloud gaming, all of that stuff. But ideally, are you a lights off and a glass of wine kind of person? Are you middle of the day, blinds open? Like, how do you set yourself up for the ideal session?
Wow, that's an interesting question. So, I guess I do. I play games a lot of different times of the day, whatever. I think I found my favorite time to play games is like weekend mornings. Usually, what happens is I'll wake up. I usually wake up the same time every day. My body just does that, and so that's for me. It's 6:30 in the morning, and so I take my dog for a walk, and that usually kills about an hour, and I come back home, and then recently it's been firing up the PS5, and I have like a weekly gaming date with a friend that I used to work with at a previous company, and we usually spend like Saturday morning and Sunday morning playing like an hour and a half or so of some online multiplayer co-op game, which right now for me is Divinity 2, and that's been like that for a couple of months.
So
pretty long
fun.
game.
Yeah, one of my
But
favorites.
incredible game. But I love that. I just like just the sereneness, have a coffee, maybe a bagel, and play games for a couple of hours on the weekend mornings. Yeah.
I think you have the same kind of idea that I do. Like, I'm much more of like a late night gamer, but I think it's for the same reasons because you're not beholden to anyone or anything at that time, right? It's
Yeah.
that the weekend is for you. You're not worried about meetings. You're not worried about text messages at 7 in the morning. You're able to kind of do your thing. I think
Yeah.
it's very undervalued.
My wife likes to sleep in too, so it's like the perfect time where like I'm not using the TV and she wants to. Yeah. So yeah, it's good.
That's awesome. So one of the really fun things about being able to do this show is that I get to talk to people of like all different seniorities, disciplines, and backgrounds. Some people in the industry, particularly with their own studios, tend to come from art, production, and all these other disciplines, but you have a programming background. So with your combined experiences at like Silicon Knights and Pseudo Interactive, what were some of the skills that you picked up that gave you the confidence to co-found Drinkbox?
Wow. Okay. Well, my programming background started outside of games actually. So I mean, I'm going to go back a little bit further, but
Please,
I won't
please.
dwell on it too much. So yeah, I did a master's degree in human computer interaction, computer science, and so I was studying. My master's thesis was like it was building 3D environments using constrained objects. So basically, it, you can find this exact thing like on IKEA's website now, where you can like build a room by just like dragging things in, and they all
Yep.
know how to kind of smartly put themselves in the room in correct ways. So my master's thesis was pretty much exactly that. At the time, all of the programs that you use for 3D stuff were they didn't have that ability. So they were basically you had to like move everything exactly in 3D, position it manually everywhere. So what I did for my thesis was we're trying to build intelligence into the objects so they know how they behave in the world, and so they snap onto things or whatever. So, but anyway, like when I graduated from university, I went into the business world because a couple of my friends who had done their master's programs before me and graduated 1 year before me, they went to a company that I ended up joining them. And so I was a consultant for like credit card companies and insurance companies, and basically working on like banking applications. You know, when you flip over your credit card and there's a phone number on the back and you call,
Fun.
the person who answers that is looking at a browser window with like an application that I would have been partially responsible for designing and writing. So,
Oh, cool.
I mean, I did that for about 3 years, and I became like mind-numbingly bored.
Yeah.
Although it paid incredibly well because there's a lot of money in those sectors. I just couldn't do it anymore. So I was working at a contract for Canadian Tire, who's in Welland, Ontario, and then I learned that Silicon. So I was always a gamer at the same time. So
Yeah.
even when I was working, on all these contracts, I was always doing gaming. And at the time I discovered that Silicon Knights was in St. Catharines, which was right next to Welland, and I had just played Eternal Darkness. And I started to get this like little nagging feeling, like, why are you working here, this boring database job, when you could be making games like Eternal Darkness? This is incredible. And so I jumped ship and took a pretty big pay cut to do it, because games traditionally don't pay, especially junior people coming in.
Yeah.
They don't pay the same as like these other sectors. Like the banking industry just has so much money. So, but I figured, like, what's more important, money or enjoying your
Doing
job?
what you love.
And yeah, so I did that and joined Silicon Knights, and so I started there just like on an entry level job, but I was there for about 3 years, and by the time I left there was something. I think it's hard to quantify, but I think, like, from the business world and from my master's degree, that those experiences kind of gave me like something that like people just joining straight out of school didn't necessarily have, because I felt like the way you solve problems, the way you approach things, the way you organized your code, that kind of stuff, I gained a lot of skills from those previous jobs before I joined Silicon Knights. So I kind of excelled there. I feel, I don't know. I don't want to brag about myself, but by the time I left, I was put in charge of the technology and the tools department, and so I was managing a bunch of people, and
That's no small feat with a company like that. Like,
yeah, and in just a couple of years too, right? So and while I was there, I was put in charge mostly of working on, because in addition to managing people, I was working on the multiplayer component of the game that they were working on. So I was the head person on all of the online the matchmaking stuff, and making sure the game worked when there was multiple people connected, and doing all that. So I gained a lot of experience in that side of things, on the multiplayer gaming.
And that's early on too. Like that's an early experience. So like things have changed so much since then that you were like kind of on the ground floor of like that new wave in gaming.
And I think when I started there, that was just around the time, just before Xbox 360 came out, because I remember just after starting there, Xbox 360 started to show up, and we were playing with them and seeing like Xbox Live for the first time, and I remember playing Geometry Wars like a long time before the Xbox 360 even came out, and I was like, wow, this game's amazing. And I think the reason that I was leading the multiplayer stuff there was because in university, for fun, my friend and I made a multiplayer game. It was like a top-down space shooting game with ships and stuff, and we were calling it massively multiplayer, but I think like when we released it, we had like 20 people at its peak. But we were just doing that for fun, and it actually worked. So when I was applying for gaming jobs, I was sending that out as a demo, and and at that time, I applied to Pseudo Interactive at the same time, and I remember going there for an interview, and they said they played my demo, and that was all cool, but since I was like such a fan of Eternal Darkness, I ended up going to Silicon Knights and working there for a few years. But then my wife, she took a job in Toronto, and so then we moved to Toronto, and I was commuting to St. Catharines, and that just became really untenable.
Too much, yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So I left Silicon Knights to join. So I reapplied to Pseudo Interactive and ended up joining there. And again, it was I joined there as a multiplayer programmer. So yeah, I never actually shipped any games at Pseudo Interactive because they were starting new projects there, and the company ended up shutting down while I was there. But I was doing some cool prototypes on some really cool projects, and the multiplayer stuff was a lot of fun to work on there as well. But like I said, one of the projects ended up getting canceled, so they had to shut down the company, and a few people from a few of the programmers. It was myself and my partners Chris and Ryan. The three of us, we got together and started Drinkbox Studios immediately afterwards. And then quickly after that, the art director, we pulled in Steph Goulet, who ended up being the Drinkbox art director, and Natai, who was like a designer at Pseudo Interactive. So there was like, and another programmer. So there was like 6 people from Pseudo Interactive were like the beginnings of Drinkbox.
So you guys kind of became like a bit of like a ragtag group and like started this new venture. So
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And like we like have a good relationship with Eric Evans, right? From Phantom Compass. Yeah. I know that you guys are friends, and hearing her at Silicon Knights and then you there as well, you kind of see where those origins start, which I like doing the show because you get to see that. Because like I think like Ontario is like a major focus of gaming in Canada, but like when you really get to know everybody, it does feel like such a small little community, and there's all these connections, which I think are really fun to see.
Yeah.
So you did a lot of on the multiplayer side, right? That was a lot of your career beforehand, and then we went into Drinkbox.
That's right. Yes. So, I mean, starting a company, there's a lot of challenges. The first challenge is we don't have any money. So,
understandably,
yeah. So, I mean, ultimately, our goal was always to make our own games, and so we were trying to figure out how to facilitate that. And a lot of the initial months and years of starting a company, there's not a lot of money coming in, and but we wanted to build our own things, and we needed to like figure out how we're going to get some cash. So basically the 3 initial founders, the 3 programmers, and to some extent also the art director and the design director, we started looking for contract work that we were to try and bring in some money into the company. So we were quite successful on the programming side doing that. And we did find some pretty cool contracts also on the design and the art side. So myself, for pretty much the first 2.5, almost 3 years at Drinkbox, I was pretty much full-time engaged on doing doing contract work for other companies to bring in money. Because when you have some money in the bank, not only can you use that to pay people something, even if it's modest, it means you can hire people. But then it also opens up some avenues to you, like, applying to the OMDC or Ontario Creates now for the IDMF, or because, you have to have some of your own cash to be able to do those things, right? So once we had a little bit of money, we started paying people some modest salaries. We started applying. So we applied to the OMDC at the time, Ontario Creates now. We applied for funding for our first game, About a Blob, and we got it. That's the poster back there, actually.
Well, we're gonna get to it. I'm excited.
Yeah. And so, a number of the people on the team were kind of split between doing contracts and working on About a Blob. Some people were full-time on About a Blob, but it allowed us to start hiring more people, especially getting the money from Ontario Creates. Now we actually have some money that we can use to build a game. So I don't know how much you want me to start getting into the development of About a Blob, but that's kind of how we set up things and how we started, paying people a salary. It was mostly through like contract work for other companies.
And so, like, speaking of, like, you're bringing all these other people on, so you started as a programmer, but then going into here, obviously you had those couple of years of outsourcing, but you started taking on more of a producer role and tend to be on the production side of things now. So what are some of the things that you really enjoy about embodying that role? And what are some of the little things that you're a little nostalgic about that you miss of your days focusing specifically on programming?
Yeah, okay. I mean, the thing that I've always loved about programming is kind of like, it feels a lot like puzzle solving. I really love puzzle solving, like, be it like a crossword puzzle or puzzle games. Like The Witness is an incredible game. So I love puzzle games, and for me, coding, a lot of it is like solving puzzles. Like, okay, I need to accomplish this thing. How am I going to do this? Like, how's the code going to be structured? Or even like when you're trying to figure out a bug, some bugs are like insanely complicated to figure out. It's like it's really like trying to solve a problem where you're attacking it from different directions. Okay, that didn't work. What am I going to do now? The puzzle solving aspect of programming is what I miss the most. But I guess like production, comes with its own kind of puzzle solving. It's like, how am I going to organize these people to create this product in the most efficient way, right? And without having like any experience, I did a little bit of like project management as part of my consulting work in my first job before I got into games, because often I would be doing a contract for a company. and but I would also be like in charge of some of their programmers and like organizing them, and so I got a little bit of project management experience that way. So, and then at Silicon Knights, I was the lead of a team as well. So, production is kind of like being a team manager, but like across multiple teams, right? And I guess like at Drinkbox, it was kind of the need for a producer became pretty obvious pretty quickly, because like you need to have someone above everyone else organizing like in between the teams, right? And sometimes you can do that a little bit. You can let that happen on its own, but once you start to get to a certain size, there really needs to be someone keeping an eye on everything and making sure that no one's getting blocked, and keeping regular meetings and everything. So it just kind of happened out of necessity more than anything else. I kind of fell into the role. And even after I fell into the role, as the team continued to grow, we found that one producer is not even enough. We needed to transition Ryan also. Ryan was also a programmer, and he became a producer as well. So now at Drinkbox, Ryan and I are pretty much just doing full-time production. We do a lot of other things too. We don't do any programming anymore, but production is part of what we do. We also do like marketing and biz dev, hiring.
I think it can be really valuable though for having someone with that kind of a programming background and like really being on the ground floor of how to make everything, that you can kind of see things that I wouldn't say most producers, but like I think you have a unique lens to look through, especially on the programming side of things, where it's like you understand every little detail of what's going on, and it kind of gives you that knowledge, being able to manage people and really actually understanding all their struggles, understanding all the issues. Yeah,
I think that's true. If a producer comes out, especially I've worked with producers who came from games, and there's a real challenge there in like even just like understanding the terms that we use making games, right? So having experience at game companies before, both as just like as a programmer, but also just making games generally, really helped me transition into being a producer at Drinkbox.
So one of the things we hinted at before that I definitely want to get into now is Tales from Space About a Blob. It's really fun seeing a studio that kind of has their reputation on Guacamelee, right? Of course, it's like the big hit, but clearly with that poster behind you, this is a game and a franchise that has like a very special place in your heart. What was the experience like making your first game at your own studio? What were some of the like memories and challenges to really putting out this franchise to begin with?
Yeah, okay. So, I mean, at the time, there's a lot of challenges. One of the first ones being, at the time there was no Unity. That didn't exist. We knew that we wanted to make a 2D game, and I remember like we were working out of my apartment. We converted. I had a 2-bedroom apartment with my wife, and we converted one of the bedrooms into the Drinkbox office.
That was a patient.
This was our, and that was our second office. Our first office was in Chris's sunroom in his house, but it was too small, so we moved to my master bedroom, which could barely fit 6 people. But at that time, we were brainstorming ideas. We decided we want to try and work on this Blob game, and we made a little tech demo using Box 2D, which is it's a physics library, which was like basically the beginnings of the Blob character, which was implemented like. It's kind of like a tank tread with springs inside of it to keep the tread, open, and we would apply forces to it, and it would roll when you're. So we made that, but and that had very crude visualizations built in for the Box 2D. But we were like, well, we need to have a game engine, so we started looking around to see what existed. Unreal was around at the time, but it didn't really have any 2D good 2D support then. There was no Unreal. So and there was a couple of weird things that no one was really using to make games, so we just ended up building our own editor. And we're still using that editor now. We've continued to build that from back in those days. We've just been continuing to add new features to that editor. So, but yeah, the first challenge was we started from scratch. We didn't have anything. We used a Box 2D library for physics and Wix widgets to make our editor, but everything else was kind of just built from the ground up, editor and game. So About a Blob took a long time. It was like one of our longer games, 3 years total from beginning to end. And part of that was like it's our first game. We're figuring out how to work as a team together, but we're also building all of the tools. Imagine like trying to. I mean, I guess like. people today probably take for granted that Unity is around, and a lot of
That
people are
is
using Unity.
kind of given.
games.
People are using Unity or Unreal, and like kind of have those options that are like almost default for most people now.
Yeah, and Unreal, I did work with Unreal before starting Drinkbox, and I've always enjoyed working in that engine. But it was prohibitively expensive, and it was more about 3D, not 2D. So it wasn't really an option. I think now, I haven't looked at it in a while, but I think it has like some 2D support, some pretty good 2D support in there now too. But at the time there was nothing, so we didn't have an option. So yeah, so it's like there was this extra hurdle of like, we don't have anything to build the game in. We have to build that too, and then build the game in it, right? So like, how are we going to make levels? Well, we have to make a thing that you can make levels in, and that was the beginnings of our editor.
Wow.
Yeah, so so that was a lot of work, but still like 3 years, 3 years total. And I think when we shipped the game, there were some things with it that we weren't entirely happy with. I'm now going to transition like into our next project, but.
Yeah.
But as part of that process, we also didn't have any relationships with any publishers or press. No one knew who we were, and rightfully so. We had never shipped a game. We're just a bunch of these unknown guys in Toronto. So the challenges that we're facing are like building the tech to make the game, and also like trying to figure out how we're going to release this game. There was a really high barrier to entry back then to get onto the consoles, and even. The game never came out on Xbox because like Xbox had some policies that you couldn't. There was no way for an indie to get their game onto Xbox 360 back then. You had to work with a publisher who put physical games onto store shelves would be allocated by Microsoft like a certain number of downloadable game slots, and then they would work with indies and like give them one of their downloadable game slots. There was no way for someone who didn't have things on store shelves to put their game digitally into Xbox Live at that time.
Even with XBLA or XBLA?
Yeah, that's right.
Wow.
Yeah, back then, initially, you had to have stuff on the store shelves. So eventually we put Guacamelee onto Xbox 360, but even then we had to work with Activision as our publisher. Yeah, so, and that was like, so you had to make a deal with a publisher, even if you didn't need that publisher's help to do it, just to get access to release on that console.
You actually beat me to one of my next questions. Was exactly that. I was like, you guys self-published most of your games. I wonder where that Activision deal came in, and that makes perfect sense.
Yeah. So this is me lamenting the troubles of the past. Like same thing with on the Sony side. It was there was a process that you had to go through called concept approval, where there was like multiple stages of concept approval. It's like, here's our game idea on paper. Okay, they signed up on that. Okay, and then the second one is like, okay, we have to give them a build, and they give you feedback. You have to integrate their feedback. They were really doing like quality control on everything that was coming out on PlayStation 3 at that time. So about a Blob, the way that we ended up getting out on PlayStation was we went to an event in Paris. It was, I think it was called Game Connection or something in Lyon, and we tried to. There was like a matchmaking service where you could like request meetings with different people, and we requested a meeting with Sony. And I wasn't actually there myself, but I know the story. So apparently Sony accepted the meeting with us because they saw the name Drinkbox, and they were like, "Oh, that's a cool name. So let's meet these Drinkbox people." And that's how we initially met Sony. And we showed them we had a demo for About a Blob, and they thought it looked pretty cool. So that's at that time they were just kicking off this program called PubFund, where they were going to help. PubFund was basically it was like an advance on royalties when you launch your game.
Oh, okay.
You would agree with them beforehand that like, yes, you're going to bring this game to Sony platforms. It's going to have some exclusivity terms, and then on day one, we're going to give you this amount of royalties, and then you're going to recoup those royalties from sales, and then you'll start to get paid more after that. But it's like it was a way for us to be able to plan, because one of the big risks is like, we worked on this game for 3 years. We're going to launch it. What if it doesn't sell? What if we don't make enough money to make back our investment? So PubFund was a way to be like, okay, well, at least we know we're going to get at least this when we launch, and then it will recoup over time, and then we'll get paid more later. So. So that PubFund thing started with About a Blob from that Lyon meeting, and so we started working with Sony pretty early in our company history, and launched About a Blob. I think that was in 2011, February 2011 on PS3.
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
well, I was gonna go on to the next game, which around the end of About a Blob's development, we started seeing stuff on the Sony forums and stuff about this new handheld device that was coming. The PSP had already been out, but it was the Vita, right? And so we learned about the Vita, and we learned that it was going to come out about a year later, February 2012. And so we really wanted to try and get a launch game for a platform. That was always like a dream of the studio, like to have a game ready to go at launch. So I mean, we started working on both Guacamelee and Mutant Blob's Attack, which is the sequel to About a Blob, at the same time, and both of those started basically around the same time as we shipped About a Blob, like February 2011. We started working on those in parallel. So the team was kind of split between the two projects. And then about October of 2011, we rolled everyone onto Mutant Blob's Attack because we really wanted to hit that beta launch, and there was still a lot of work to do. And I don't know how we did it. We made Mutant Blob's Attack in 1 year, and that's the only game we've ever made in 1 year. It was, but it's reusing a lot of the tech. The level editor is already there. So we could still build levels, but there's still a lot of work. The game is very different. It's much more fast paced. It used the Vita, the touchscreen, like you would be able to drag platforms around to manipulate the platforms, so you could do platforming over them. The blobs had all these new powers that didn't exist in the first game, and completely new levels. And so it was. I feel like really proud of us being able to accomplish that in just 1 year. And we barely squeaked it out. We were there on launch day. The Vita actually ended up getting pre-released to press, and it actually came out a week earlier than what they had said the launch day was going to be.
It was a weird situation.
Yeah, we weren't there for that first week, but the actual launch day we were in the store, and I think we were one of the highest reviewed titles, and we were definitely the least expensive title. So the game did really well. Like, a lot of people bought it and found out about us from that Vita launch. So that was really cool.
That kind of leads us into, I think, what kind of made Drinkbox's name. It was like kind of the next era for the studio was Guacamelee. Do you feel like you making those 2Ds originally, you had always had a plan that you wanted to make a Metroidvania, which I think is an overused genre, but it's probably the best way to explain what a lot of these games are, and they're so near and dear to so many people's hearts. Did that feel daunting, or did you feel that you had really kind of cut your teeth doing these like the iterations of Tales from Space? Sorry.
Yeah, so we started on Guacamelee at the same time as Mutant Blobs, and that was it was a result of brainstorming sessions we had in the company. So we're wrapping up About a Blob's work, and we're like, okay, what are we going to work on next? We had this idea that maybe we'll be able to work on this sequel on Sony's new platform, but at that time we didn't know that was going to happen for sure, because Sony was they were very protective of their hardware. They weren't even telling us anything about it. We didn't know the specs or that it had a touchscreen or anything. But we really wanted to. We were like pestering them. Can you tell us what it is? Can we get hardware? Can we make a game? And eventually they did, and they started shipping us that stuff. But in parallel to all that, we were doing brainstorming sessions for like, what do we want to work on next? And the way we typically do this at Drinkbox is everyone on the team makes pitches, multiple pitches, and we'll pick a day and just sit in a circle, and we'll go around and everyone will pitch their ideas, and we'll do that multiple times. And people are pitching ideas, we're giving feedback, and people can refine their ideas and repitch. But for Guacamelee, Guacamelee ended up being kind of a combination, or I say Frankenstein of a lot of different ideas. So our concept lead, Augusto Cojiano, he pitched Guacamelee in the way we do the pitches is like we call it a onesie. It's like a single page with like a bunch of images and like some text like describing what the game is. And Augusto had a onesie for Guacamelee, which I think we have it online somewhere, but it didn't. It basically, he was pitching it as a brawler. He was using Castle Crashers as an example for like a luchador game. But he captured he had the name of Juan and Carlos Colaca, the bad guy, and he had some concept arts of those guys and the story and how and why, what is it to be a luchador? What is so he basically pitched the story of the game, and And then there was another pitch that was a Metroidvania game, and it had some really cool things. I think that one specifically was saying that a Metroidvania game where your fighting moves are also your platforming moves. And so
such a fun idea.
Yeah, so like in Guacamelee, eventually, your uppercut is also like you can jump and then uppercut, and it's like a double jump, or you can do. We have a punch that's also a dash, right? So that was pulled from that pitch, and then there was another one that was kind of like a shooting game that was like a Ikaruga style, light world, dark world, and we took that aspect of that game and made it like the living world and the dead world in Guacamelee, and there was one more idea.
So you literally just mashed like all these together, like took the best pieces of the pieces that like spoke out to you the most, and it was kind of like that's how Guacamelee came to be.
Exactly, yeah. And so we did that, and then we started doing some concept work, and we made a video using Flash of like what is this game going to look like. And if you're curious, we have that on our YouTube channel, Drinkbox's YouTube channel. That initial Flash video is there, and you can see this was made like really early 2011, and that Flash video, and compared to the final game, very, very close. Like the initial vision and the final game, they really.
But you don't see that. You usually see like that a couple years worth of iterations on things, but the fact that you guys captured that from the beginning, I think, kind of shines through in the final game. Is that you had that cohesive vision from the beginning, and you all kind of were working towards the same goal.
Yeah. And I mean, the one unfortunate thing about that Flash video was when we started showing it to people, like, we always go around and pitch our games to publishers and like, hey, do you want to work with us on this or partner? A lot of people saw that video and they couldn't get past the visuals because it was like really rough. And they would say things like, this looks like a Flash game. And I'm like, okay, well, it's because we made this video in Flash.
Yeah, maybe that's why. Yeah.
But, the final product, this has happened to us so many times. Like it's, every time we go to pitch with early materials, people just can't get past the visuals. They can't see the final product. They don't see a lot of people, they'll pass. And the reason they'll pass is because we can tell it's because of the visuals. Guacamelee was no exception. We were pitching 2 games at that same time. So the reason we ended up working on Guacamelee was because that was the one that most people were kind of like, oh, this sounds really cool. Mm-hmm. But they couldn't get past the visuals, so they didn't want to partner with us. But anyway, that's how we started working on Guacamelee. Once we released Me and Blob's Attack on Vita, the whole team shifted onto Guacamelee, and a year later, Guacamelee came out. So,
but like, look who has the last laugh at the end of that. Because usually, when a lot of people think back to Guacamelee, like I think it's one of the most distinct art styles, and I think Drinkbox really has that reputation that you can see something and you're like, that I feel like that's a Drinkbox game, and then you find out that it is. But like I think that's a unique thing to have and a really powerful thing to have, because a lot of studios you'll have. Game to game will be completely different, or you can see a couple of little things down there. But when you look at Guacamelee and then you look at Nobody Saves the World, I'm like, I can see how you got from here to here. Like you can see that line and that inspiration.
And I mean, you'll also see like as each game comes out, our tech gets a little bit better too. Like if you go back and play Guacamelee now, it doesn't have any normal mapping or like dynamic 3D lighting or anything like that. So like, I mean, I think what you're saying is like you can kind of recognize the art style, but
the art style.
Yeah. But progressively, like we keep trying to push the visuals a little bit further with each game, adding more effects and shaders and whatnot. But the underlying art is still being made by the same team. So
So in between doing Guacamelee 1 and 2, you guys kind of took a breath and you made a first-person action RPG called Severed. And then when we get into Nobody Saves the World, that's also a completely different camera angle, completely different type of game. So I'm like, I like that you guys don't really have a quote-unquote bread and butter. You kind of pivot and change, but you still have that like vibrancy and the color and the feel of a game. So like, and I find that very fascinating, being able to see studios do that. So I'm sure the Guacamelee sequel was greenlit probably pretty close after release, is my assumption, just because I know how well it did and critically acclaimed it was. What pushed the team to do Severed first before just jumping into this sequel?
When we finished Guacamelee, we had not decided that we were going to do a sequel yet for Guacamelee, but there was still like a bunch of stuff that had to get cut, during the development process to be able to finish the game. So we had like some really cool concepts for like some, bosses or different ideas of how the story could work in that game. So it was always in the back of our minds, like we can come back to this world. There's more to do here. And, but when you work on a game for 2 years, by the end of that 2 years, you're usually pretty sick of that game. You played it so many times. at least on our team, everyone plays the game. Everyone gives feedback. I play, like, most recently I played through Nobody Saves the World probably a dozen times, and that's like a 20-hour game. And, so you get sick of the game usually by the end. So
I'm gonna put the controller down for a bit. Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, I've described Severed as kind of like a palate cleanser. Like, we really needed to do something completely different, and we did our brainstorming process again. And I think we did it a little bit different in the time of Severed. We did like a game jam where we split the team up into 4 groups, and each group made a game. And Severed was one of the ideas that was made out of that. At the time, you were using a mouse instead of your finger on a touchscreen, but the basic idea of the combat was established there, and the navigating in the world, kind of using like a Google Maps or Google Street View kind of navigation, was kind of fleshed out in that game jam. And I mean, of all the ideas that we had at that time, Severed was the one that the team was the most excited about, and also excited about doing something that was more dark. Like, if you play Severed, it's About a Blob is really silly. Blob's attack is really silly. Guacamelee is very silly. It's like, okay, let's do something completely different. It's dark. The protagonist is a young woman who's gone through a tragedy. She's lost her arm. Her family's missing. Throughout the course of the story, you learn, spoilers, her family may not have survived the tragedy. Like, she's in this weird limbo with all these weird creatures, and it's very dark and oppressive. And the gameplay is completely different as well. So we modified our engine, and we started working on this weird game. We really loved working on the Vita, so we were initially targeting it on Vita. But as we were going through the development, the Vita's life cycle, I'm really sad about this, but
it's like breaks my heart too. In the same,
So the Mutant Blobs came out at the launch, and then Guacamelee came out in the middle, and it was also on Vita. And then Severed kind of came out at the end, and
Swan Song.
And when Severed launched, like a lot of the reviews started by saying, "I dusted off my Vita to play," and I'm like, "Oh no, Vita's gone." But yeah, I'm really proud of that game. I mean, it was also a learning experience for me, that working on a dark game, it actually has like an emotional toll on you that you wouldn't
mentally taxing
expect.
For sure.
Yeah, like when you're working on Guacamelee and you're having design meetings, you're just laughing all the time. All these like stupid things are being suggested, and like it's fun, right? With Severed, it was never the same like that. Like, the ideas are, because everything is serious and dark when you're talking about the story. Like, so it was a more taxing project for sure, and not only because of the subject matter and the tone, but because the technical challenges were new for us. There's not really any games out there that are like Severed. There was one that Epic made. The name is eluding me right now. That was kind of like a touch-based sword fighting thing, but it was really different from what we were doing. The mechanics we had in that game were, I think, still pretty unique, and so we were confronted like constantly with design problems that we were like, how are we going to solve this? And just like racking our brains and trying different things and doing play tests, and this isn't working. How are we going to do this? But so it felt like a lot of work to push through those problems and get the game out. So once we launched Severed, it was almost like a breath of relief to go back to Guacamelee and work on Guacamelee 2. Everyone on the team was like,
joy, bring the joy back into the office and have a fun time in these meetings again.
Exactly, yeah.
Because you learn a lot through those experiences, all right? And I feel like that, like you said, it's a palate cleanser. You can kind of like, okay, like take it down a notch, do something a little more grounded, a little more gritty, and then the fun comes back, and it's 10 times better going back. And I can imagine going back into Guacamelee 2 and just being like, feels like home.
Yeah, exactly. So yes, I mean, Severed, like, we're really proud of Severed, and it won a lot of awards. We got like iPad Game of the Year, and I did a search, and it was like 50,000 games came out on iPad that year. I'm like, wow, okay, that's incredible. But and there was also, we learned a lot because it was the first time we did anything on mobile. It's the first and only time we've ever released a game on phones. But we also learned, like, we want to be a studio that can target lots of platforms. Like, the touch-based aspect of Severed really prevented us from bringing it, across the board to all the platforms. So that's something that we haven't done since either. because we want to try and get it on. We wanted to try and get our games out to as many people as possible.
That actually kind of ties into another question I have later about trying to get it. We're talking about Game Pass. But please continue.
Yeah, yeah. So I think that's all I really want to say about Severed. It's a game that we're really proud of, but I don't think we're ever going to go back to that world because of the reasons I said. It's like I think we're going to try and stick with like lighthearted, toned games going forward, just because of they're just more fun to work on, and everybody on the team kind of knows that now. It's not something we knew beforehand, though. Yeah,
that's totally fair because you don't know it until you try it, right? Where it's like, oh, maybe we want to do something a little more grounded, and you're like, that is emotionally exhausting. Like.
Yeah, and I think you can still have like serious,
of course,
stories inside of lighthearted games. There's a lot of games that do that really well. So that's kind of what we try and do. We don't want the game stories to be just like completely fluff. We want to have some seriousness in there as well.
There's some humanity to it, which I think
exactly
helps everybody connect emotionally with the story, right? Whether it's fun or not. So then, you guys went back into the world of Guacamelee too.
Yeah.
Right. Was there any unique jumps? Because obviously, like, this industry moves faster than most other industries in the world. So, of course, tech was one thing, but was there anything that was happening in the industry during that time off, that you were like, hey, we might be able to pull from that, or hey, that really inspires me and makes me want to throw that into the game?
I don't remember anything specifically to that, but I do remember at the start of the project when we were going back to the Guacamelee 2, when we were going back to the Guacamelee world. Initially, we wanted to try and make it completely different from the first game in terms of like the mechanics, and we spent a lot of time prototyping things that just weren't as intuitive or simple as the original Guacamelee. Because I don't know if you've played the game, the abilities, the Metroidvania abilities that you unlock are basically mapped to like up and B, down and B, left B. So it's very simple, like a direction, a button, or direction the same button is used for all of those.
Easy to pick up and easy to understand. It communicates very well with the player.
Exactly, and during Guacamelee's development, it took us some time to arrive at that. Like initially, to do an uppercut, you had to do like a Street Fighter uppercut input.
I was gonna say, like,
yeah, and to do a dash punch, you had to do a fireball input. And when we started playtesting that, when you're playing under pressure and fighting like multiple enemies, you're just messing up those all the time, and it was making the game less fun. I guess that wasn't something that was obvious to us at the time. So then we started Guacamelee 2, and we're kind of, okay, back to the drawing board. What are the abilities going to be this time? And we tried a lot of different things, and a lot of failed experiments. And so eventually we were like, okay, it doesn't seem like it's a good idea for us to deviate too much from the main player's abilities, but maybe we can supplement that. And so what we ended up doing as part of the big new thing in Guacamelee 2 is that one of the abilities you get in Guacamelee 1 is you get the ability to turn into a chicken. And it's kind of like our version of the morph ball in Metroid. It allows you to squeeze into like tight tunnels. And it had a peck attack, like you could peck enemies, but it didn't really do much damage. And we forced you to do it in like one small section of the game, but you never wanted to be a chicken to fight things. In Guacamelee 2, we were like, okay, let's expand this chicken. So we gave the chicken all kinds of new abilities. So there's like in Guacamelee 2, you get all the Metroidvania abilities from the first game on your main character, and then you get a whole bunch of new abilities in the chicken. And the game will put you into sections where it becomes immediately obvious, I need to be a chicken in this section because I need to use the chicken abilities to do this platforming, or I need to use the chicken abilities to break these enemy shields. So it was that's where, like, once we figured that out and we were like, okay, we're going to explore this chicken thing, that's where the game started to open up, and we started to all the ideas started coming like about the chicken stuff. And the game has a storyline about the chicken Illuminati and all the silliness about that. And so yeah, that was the discovery that allowed us to build out that whole game and make that game good.
I think that kind of leads right into your newest game. I feel like there was a lot of probably things that you guys were brainstorming during that chicken form that was like, hey, maybe there's something more here.
Yeah.
So we definitely want to talk about Nobody Saves the World, right? Brand new title,
Absolutely.
January 18th, 2022. Game Pass right now, Windows. We'll talk about that. So for those unfamiliar, the game itself is an action RPG dungeon crawler where the main character can take on different forms, which in turn gives them different abilities, some which can be combined. So as usual, a genre or a brief description of a game can't possibly do it justice. I had to write this part, but I wanted to say like it can't be overstated how fun this game was. This was something that I really got to dive into over the weekend. And also how weird this game is, and like just the unsettling vibes of the art direction, which I enjoy in a twisted way, right? Like, of course, it looks gorgeous, but like certain things can be off-putting with characters with no eyes.
Yeah.
But it speaks, I think, to the character of the game, and it kind of helps you embody that character, which I think is kind of ironic. So like, as manages to also have like a very like distinct and visual style. Did the look come first? Did these gameplay mechanics come first? Or was it something else entirely that really inspired the idea of Nobody Saves the World?
Okay, so I think the first thing that came with Nobody Saves the World that I remember clearly was the form tree. It's basically in the game. It's the menu that you use to switch between the different character forms that you can play as, and that was done really early on by Augusto, who he did a very silly. It basically looks like a tree or a graph with like nodes that are just random things. Like there's a centaur, there's a robot, there's a hamster, there's just weird. There's a ghost. There's all these weird things, and I think his initial one had like 35 things on it. The game ended up shipping with 18, which is as many as we could do in the time we had.
That's still so many.
Yeah.
With so many playable characters, like.
And you know, from the serious to the bizarre, like there was the section of the tree that was like the mage and then ice mage and fire mage, and then there was another section of the tree that, like, I remember specifically he had like ham. You can play as a ham. And then he had stairs, like you could play as stairs, and then if you unlock both of those, then you get hamster, like ham and stairs makes hamster. So, and for the longest time, we were going to put ham and stairs into the game, but I mean,
stairs how to make it work. Yeah,
yeah. It's like, okay, so to play as the stairs, I need to help people climb up things.
Yeah,
is that what I need
to add some verticality to this level? Yeah.
But that was the seed of the idea. Like just this, we wanted to make the game was pitched actually by Chris, one of the founders, who is now the technical director, and he was pitching it as like a Might and Magic Clash of Heroes style, like the job system in Might and Magic. It's not Clash of Heroes. I'm forgetting which game it is, but the job system in that game. It lets you do like so many different things, like fishing. Like if you're fishing, your fishing stat goes up and you become a great fisherman. And so he wanted just like the way that game forces you to do completely different things to level up, different aspects of your character. That was the kernel of the idea. And at the time he was pitching the game, it was called Legendary Dungeons. That was the initial name that we had, which I'm very happy we changed because it's a very boring name. But like the idea was like you're gonna do this thing. You're gonna go around the world and clear the 8 legendary dungeons, and you're gonna do this using your abilities these completely different abilities that you're gonna be switching between constantly. And so then Augusto did the form tree mock-up, and then those two things kind of came together, and that's where Nobody Saves the World, the seed of Nobody Saves the World, came from. And again, we did the same kind of process as we did with Guacamelee. There was like this flash video that was made, kind of showing what the game would look like, and we brought it around and pitched it to publishers, and everyone was like, "This looks like a Flash game," and all that. And that video, I don't think we have that on YouTube yet, but it'll go up sometime soon, probably. Again, you watch that video, that's from 3 years ago, and you look at the game that came out, and it's like, yes, it's exactly right. The main hook in Nobody Saves the World, like once you get into the meat of the game, it's you have to complete these dungeons in order to save the world. And when you approach a dungeon, the dungeon has like a description, and it tells you like what kind of enemies am I going to have to fight in here. And the dungeons also have modifiers, so it's like I can see when I approach a dungeon that I'm going to need to have certain types of attacks, and my my ranged attacks won't do any damage because this dungeon says ranged attacks don't do damage, and my healing abilities won't work. And so every time you approach a dungeon, it tells you these are the restrictions inside this dungeon. And so you have to look at like the characters that you have and try and figure out which character you want to start with, and then you can take that character and you can customize it by bringing in abilities from other characters. So you can basically make your own build before you go into each dungeon. It's like there's this build crafting element to it. Another element that's part of it is in order to progress in the game at all, you have to do quests. The game is all about questing. So the way that at the game you start with just a single character called Nobody, and then you do a couple of quests as Nobody, like walk around and smash things, and then by doing those quests and redeeming them, you rank up Nobody, and when you rank up Nobody, you unlock some new forms, and then you start playing as the new form, and the new form has completely different quests that are just associated to that form. And as you do those quests, not only do you unlock new forms, you also unlock new abilities for that form. So when you start a form, they basically can just do one thing, and it's very simple. Like the ranger starts with an arrow, so you hold the button to charge the arrow and you let it go. And once you've done the quest to hit things with your charged arrow, you get another ability, which is dodge. And so now the ranger can dodge as well as shoot the arrows. And then a new quest shows up, dodge through 10 enemies. And so you finish that quest and you get another ability, which is it's called arrow flurry. And it's like a machine gun of arrows. Now you're trying to hit things with, shoot 10 arrows into a single enemy using arrow flurry, right? So you're always doing these quests. It's like constantly in your face. So when you're constructing your build to go into a dungeon, there's another aspect. It's like, okay, which part of the form tree do I want to try and progress? Like which one of these characters am I trying to rank up so I can get more abilities or more forms? So it's like, okay, maybe I want to play as the horse because I want to unlock the monk, and I can see the monk is the next class that I'm going to get at if I can rank up the horse. But the horse can't do ranged damage, so I need to pull in the arrow flurry from the ranger because I know ranged damage is boosted in this dungeon, right? So you're always like approaching a dungeon, looking at the constraints, and then theory crafting this build with lots of different constraints, like not only to finish the dungeon, but also because you want to try and finish as many quests as you can and try and unlock new things. Like you're trying to maximize all of that stuff. So there's a lot of complexity there. At the beginning of the game, it seems very simple. This is kind of like slowly revealed to you as you like start to get more forms, and the restrictions on the dungeons become more complex. So yeah, it is an ARPG, but it's very unique because I don't know that I'm aware of any ARPGs that have the same kind of loop where every time you come to a dungeon, it's like, okay, what I did in the last dungeon won't work here. I got to do something completely different.
You need to build a custom build per dungeon, essentially.
Exactly, and also once you're about like halfway through the game, you have so many different forms and so many abilities that the options are almost, well, I'm not going to say limitless, but there's like dozens of ways that you can do it. Right? It's really up to you. So when I was saying before about like by the time you finish a game, you're usually sick of the game. I remember playing through Guacamelee, or Guacamelee 2, and that game was only 6 hours long, and I could beat it in 4.5. But every time you played it, it was exactly the same experience, exactly the same. With Nobody Saves the World, it's closer to a 20-hour experience. If you're good at the game, you can beat it in like a dozen hours, but for new players, it's about 20 hours. But every time I played Nobody Saves the World, except for the very initial part of the game when you're kind of like, you don't have a lot of options, you can play the game completely differently every time. So, for example, I was playing the game, I'm doing some testing just a couple weeks ago, and I played through the whole game again. And this time I was like, oh, I never really played so much as the Ghost. And I started using the Ghost character in a lot of the dungeons. And I'm like, this is so fun. I was finding really cool combinations that I never discovered before. And this is someone who's played this game like a dozen times already, right? So it's not, yeah. So surprisingly, even though it's taking me way longer to beat the game this time around, it wasn't as painful to play it every time because, you're always finding like new things to do and new customizations.
There's actually one thing I wanted to touch on was obviously the combining of different abilities. So like you've basically given characters like a ridiculous amount of like customization and power. How fun was it to test internally to see which ones were broken and how OP some of these must have been that probably ended up on the cutting room floor? Like this and this can't go together, or else people are just going to wipe through every dungeon.
There was definitely a couple of So the QA team was pretty good at finding those things. We do want people to find OP builds. That's
Fair.
because it feels really good to go into a dungeon and just like destroy everything because you're like you feel smart, right? You're like that was a really clever combination that I think came up with. But the thing is we don't want is that then you can just use that same build in the next dungeon and then you just finish the game, right? So we really tried to structure the game to make it so that you cannot progress. There's things in the game that make it so that you cannot progress if you just keep using the same stuff. It doesn't work. You have to be doing new quests on new characters constantly if you want to be able to progress. So it's built into the structure to prevent people from just finding a single OP build. We want you to find lots of OP builds. But there was one combination that you could put onto anything that would allow you to get all of your mana back, and then you could use any of the healing spells. The horse had an ability called Graze, where if you just stopped moving, some grass would grow around the horse, and the horse would get all the mana back. But it was quite slow, and you could upgrade it to make it a little bit faster. So we had that, and then you could use one of the healing spells to heal yourself back up, and then let your mana come back up again. And if you needed more healing, you could do it again. So what ended up happening was people would figure this out in playtests, and anytime they were starting to get low health, they would just stop playing, heal themselves as much as they could, wait for the mana to come back, heal themselves again, repeat until they're full health and full mana, and then start playing again. So they would stop playing for 45 seconds or something. It's like, we cannot chip the game like this. You cannot have this. So we had to change the horse's Graze ability to something else. Now the horse gets extra mana back from breaking things.
There you go.
You have to break
people
things.
have to be actively engaged rather than just kind of sitting around and waiting.
Exactly. So, there was things like that. I would consider that something that's game breaking, something you could put onto any character that would allow you to always have full health and mana. No, we don't allow that. And a few other things like that throughout the course of the project. But at the same time, there's lots of OP ability combinations that you can use for a little while, but they just won't work everywhere. Yeah.
It makes sense because you can kind of see, okay, this is what people are going to kind of lean towards, and it's like we need to make kind of a hard stop. So they're forced to switch and forced to find different combinations and things like that.
Yeah, that's right.
So a lot of the combo forms are actually showcased on Drinkbox's TikTok, Twitter. It's really fun to follow you guys on social and see a lot of those. Being like, I never would have thought of those. Those are fantastic to see. And I think that really helps build a community and a sense of loyalty towards the company, just because of the fun and lighthearted nature of the game, but also with the communications with your community and with fans at large. What do you think are some of the steps you guys learned along the way for community management that you think other studios, maybe with a little less resources, could kind of learn from and take from?
Okay, that's a good question. So along the way from the beginning of Drinkbox, we started trying to do everything on our own at the beginning of the like I said, we would spend a lot of effort going to PAX, for example. We would get a booth at PAX, and they're not cheap. We would spend a lot of time designing the booth and making a demo and bringing it to PAX, and then we would email all the press email addresses that were part of the press list, and then no one would show up. Because, like I said, at the beginning, especially for during About a Blob, when we were developing that, nobody knew who we were, right? We had that lucky meeting with Sony because they liked our name, but getting the press to come out was quite challenging because they want to go see the companies that they've heard of, right? And who's this Drinkbox making About a Blob? I remember one time we were at PAX it was PAX West in Seattle, and there was another indie just across from us, and he had people showing up constantly, and he had TV cameras, and I'm like, what's going on? So I went over and asked him, how are you getting all these people coming? And he's like, oh yeah, I just worked with a PR company. I'm like, there's PR companies that do this? So that kind of spurred us to start doing that. We now pretty much every project we'll partner with a PR company to help us with a lot of different things. I'll get back to the social media side of things in a second, but especially for when we're launching the game, making sure that review codes are getting sent out, following up with people, making sure that they've tried the game, or like for trade shows, which haven't really happened in the last couple of years with the pandemic, but going to PAX and getting meeting setups. Some of these PR companies have like really good contact lists, and they'll email someone and someone will actually answer them, right? Because they have established relationships. We found a lot of value in that. And, over the years, we've tried a lot of different companies. The first time we started working with a PR company was during Mutant Blob's attack. And I think we did a press tour. We flew to California to do a press tour with a PR company. They'll give you a lot of different options. A lot of PR companies are willing to work with indies on a budget. They'll scale how much stuff they're doing with you based on your budget. So I think, I would highly recommend to people who are trying to do stuff on their own. I mean, you can always do it on your own too, and eventually, maybe there's more of a value there once you've been able to establish relationships yourself. Because the press want to talk. The press don't want to talk to PR people. They want to talk to the developers, right? So, over the years, we've met a lot of these people, and I do think we could take that over and do all that reach out ourselves too. But that's also a very time-consuming thing to do, like setting up meetings or setting up review codes. And probably not what you want to be doing. You want to be focused on making your game, right? And so if you can still do the meetings with them and promote your game to them directly, but not be the person setting up those meetings, that's the kind of the ideal scenario that we found. So I don't know. That's a long lead up to the social media side.
Though. No, that's 100% fair. Yeah.
We've also, the same thing with social media. We've been trying to do this on our own over the years, and usually at Drinkbox, there's like one person who's kind of in charge of handling social media stuff. With the Blob games, we were doing, we were putting out Twitter stuff. Like, I remember we had a Twitter campaign where we were inserting the Mutant Blob into different places in the world. Here's the Mutant Blob in Paris now and in Toronto, and
that's fun though.
And and that was fun. And we've done a lot of fun experiments on Twitter over the years too. But the same thing, it's like, we don't. We want the person who was doing our social media always also had other responsibilities.
Yes, I think that's most studios that have that. That's why, I think it's hard for people to find the balance and really see that direct value of that engagement, right? Whether it's like either I can be working on the game, doing production or doing whatever else your main job is, and then you're kind of doing the community management thing on the side.
Yeah. So and then depending on who it is, I mean, because social media is not simple either, right? You actually have to think about what am I going to like? I mean, you can just put stuff out there and maybe not get any engagement. But if you want to get engagement, you kind of got to think about like a plan, like what kind of stuff do you want to be putting out? How do you want to present the game? So for our latest iteration, I mean, there's a lot of evolution that happened over the years. But now, most recently, we're still working with a PR company. And the PR company we're working with, they're called Pop Agenda. They have someone on their team that is helping us do social media stuff. So he his name is George. He's thinking about like cool ideas, or he'll. So we decide as a group. Like we review. He basically makes proposals, and the Drinkbox team reviews the proposals and signs off. We sign off on everything before it goes out. But
of course.
But we'll decide as a group. Yeah, we want to do a campaign where we're going to do forum spotlights, so we're going to do all the different forums, or we're going to do like customization videos with different kinds of customizations. So the Drinkbox team will make suggestions of what the customizations could be, and then George can go away and make the videos and then present them to us, and then we sign off, and then they get scheduled and posted. So it's kind of a collaborative effort between us and a PR company right now. And that's been working really well. I don't think we don't use a PR company always. It's usually like just leading up to launch. So eventually that's going to transition back entirely to Drinkbox. But that also freed up our team to, because, the people that are part of this process on our side, one of them's an artist, one of them's, on the QA team and also doing some production. And there's myself and Ryan. So that frees up our time to focus just on making the game. And, we still do brainstorming a little bit and we still do approvals, but we're not like, no one on our team is actually spending, hours making the video that's going to go onto TikTok,
That makes perfect sense. That's just something that I've always noticed with Drinkbox, and like you guys went from announcement to launch in 10 months, which do you find that's like kind of a sweet spot, or do you think some studios can benefit from a longer runtime, a shorter runtime? I'm personally I like that just under a year, that it's in the public consciousness. You don't want something out there for 3 years because then that kind of gets fatigued.
Yep. Yeah, I do think that is pretty much a sweet spot, and that's another learning from Severed. We announced Severed quite early, and we had thought when we announced, we thought we were about 8 months out from launch, but because of design challenges and whatnot, we ended up taking like much longer. Like it was a year and a half between our announcement and our launch. And what happened was near the end, before our launch, we would try and set up meetings, and press would say, well, you've already showed us the game. We just want to play it, right? We're ready for it. So you kind of, you only have so much time to keep people excited about something. And if it's, it's probably a different story with like bigger games. Like, I don't think like Cyberpunk or maybe that's not the best example.
The one on the tip of my tongue too, especially after this stuff yesterday. Yeah.
People they would like, or Elden Ring. Like anything that comes out with those games, people just want to see it. But with a small indie game like Severed, we learned like you don't want to announce too early, because there's press fatigue that sets in, and you can still get meetings, but they're not going to write about your game 4 times before you launch if it's just a small indie game, right? So you kind of want to save that for the end and try and maximize the coverage you can get.
And the worst thing that you can think of is like people, I thought the game was already out, and you're like, you know what I mean? It's like, no, like it's still 6 months out, or blah blah blah. So something that I want to touch on very briefly, just to kind of get your thoughts on it. Launch date, January 18th, 2022.
Yeah.
Some other big gaming news happened that same day.
Yes, it did.
But it was really fun being able to watch. Like, I'm a big fan of like Easy Allies and like Kind of Funny and like things like that. So that PR, getting all those codes out there and people having their hands on it, people still talked about it. It was still a big thing, and it has had legs, which has been really fun to see. I'm just kind of curious. I'm sure it's a bit of a sore topic. I'm just curious of like some of those internal conversations of being like, okay, does that change any of the strategies moving forward? Or it's like, let's stick the course. These kind of games have a lot of longevity. Your reputation kind of sticks with you. The great Open Critic score really benefits, right? So these games have a lot of legs.
That was a complete surprise. We didn't know that announcement was happening. Nobody knew. So we selected our launch date probably about 6 weeks before, like we solidified it. And I still think it was probably the best launch date we ever had, because there was like a really good gap in the release calendar, so that we got a lot of reviews and a lot of coverage from outlets, because there wasn't.
Oh, it was everywhere.
And there wasn't any other big games for people to play, right? So a lot of people are coming back, and we sent out codes before the holiday break too. So a lot of people had, you gave them time. The last week of December, the first weeks of January, to play the game, write up the reviews, and get them ready to go. So it's true that like when the game came out and the coverage was all released, there was also this bigger article that Microsoft, the acquisition, but I don't think it really hurt us in any way. And in fact, like it feels like, because of the date we chose, being like kind of clear of other titles, we had a really good launch. Like not only were the press able to write about it or have bandwidth to write about it, because they didn't have to worry about writing about Elden Ring. By the way,
fair.
Elden Ring initially was scheduled for January 18th.
I know.
And then we moved our date to February, and then Elden Ring moved to February, and then we moved our date back to January 18th. So because we're just, it's smart. Like chasing us. Yeah.
Some companies don't do that. Some companies are like, man, like if you can adjust even by a couple weeks, like get out of the way. Like Elden Ring is going to just slaughter everything, right? So
I wouldn't want to release in the next couple of weeks between Horizon and Elden Ring. It's
Destiny 2. There's too much going on over the next couple of weeks. It's a lot.
Yeah. I don't think that news affected us too much. It was just a little bit unfortunate. I think but sometimes you just don't know what's going to happen.
Of course.
Like when we launched Guacamelee, I think it was Guacamelee. Yeah. It was like I think Spelunky came out the same time as us, and I had seen like, I'm looking in the release calendar, and I'm like, what's this Spelunky game? And it just like it didn't resonate with me that it would be like this humongous title, right? And we totally would have tried to avoid that if we had known in advance. So like that was one of the learnings from previous projects as well. Like we are very, very careful about choosing our release dates now, trying to avoid other big indie games, AAA games, and the calendar is extremely crowded too, right? So sometimes there's like not a lot of great options. But this year, January, there was a few weeks in there. It was perfect. So yeah.
It worked out well. That was just something that I had to ask just personally, because like it was something I was looking forward to, and like obviously all the coverage, and then it's just like open your phone, it's like Activision, blah blah blah. I was like, no,
they had to announce it that day.
Yeah, it had to be, of course. That kind of leads into like one of my last questions actually I have for you is that Nobody Saves the World came to Game Pass. So personally, I love when some of my favorite indies come to Game Pass because I really think that can really expose them to a whole different audience of people. Maybe people that haven't either had familiarity with the game or even with the studio themselves. So obviously, like you can't talk details about Game Pass itself or like the Xbox ecosystem. But what made you decide to have it as a launch platform exclusive and come to Game Pass?
That's a good question. So if you rewind back a couple of years, we actually when we were pitching this game initially using the Flash video, we actually got a publisher. We had a publisher, and we worked with a publisher for a whole year. And I can't really say who it is or anything.
Of course.
But yeah, we worked with them for a whole year. I think we signed with them like in 2019, late 2019. And then, but we had started working with them already. That took a long time for the signing to happen. But then in April of 2020, they canceled the project. And it was part of like an initiative change. I know we weren't the only one. There was like a couple dozen projects got canceled. So no hard feelings.
So it's not personal, yeah.
Yeah, and they funded that first year. So. That was actually a nice benefit. So we found ourselves. It was like April 2020. We found ourselves like, okay, like what do we want to do? Do we want to finish the game ourselves?
A time. April 2020 and going through that.
Yeah, it was. That's true. Like that, the cancellation happened like shortly. It was like just around when everything was locking down, and COVID is spreading through the world. So we tried to basically say, like, from here, where do we want to go? Do we want to self-publish on all platforms, or do we want to try and partner with a platform holder? What are our options? So luckily, we had developed the game for quite a while at that point. We had we had a playable build. Still, like, it's still pretty early. Like the visuals always get better all the way to the end, right? So, and this is like maybe about halfway through development. So still, it's pretty early. It's still pretty rough. The game design is still being fleshed out. But we thought, okay, we're like, maybe the best way to make this decision is like, let's pitch it to everybody and see what the options are. And so yeah, we pitched it to all the platforms. We pitched it to other publishers, and it turns out that Microsoft was the most interested. So we started talking to them about it more seriously. They wanted it to be, part of ID at Xbox with some exclusivity, but also part of Game Pass. And they actually, I don't want to say too much because.
Oh, of course. That I wanted to preface it with that being like, whatever you're able to. I'm just curious of what like attracted you to that.
But the game wasn't going to have online multiplayer. That was something that the Microsoft team asked for as part of the discussions with them. Mm-hmm. And back to the very beginning of our conversation, I used to be a network programmer, right? And
there you go. It all comes back. Yeah.
And not just me, like Ryan and some of the contracts we did at the beginning of Drinkbox, we worked on Marvel Ultimate Alliance 2 with Activision. I worked on that game for over a year, doing the multiplayer. Drinkbox did all of the multiplayer in that game, and all the multiplayer support was done by us. So both Ryan and Chris, the other two founders, were working on that project too. We were all doing multiplayer programming. So the reason we had never done it in our own games is because we knew how expensive and complex it is, right? Like we want to keep our budgets low. We want to be profitable and have low risk. So we've never done it. But then when we were talking with Microsoft about Game Pass and multiplayer, we decided, okay, maybe it's time to do it. Maybe we there's benefits, right? Like once we get this into our engine, then we have it for future games, right? And it's an investment into our own infrastructure, like that we can use going forward. Plus, like we have this deal on the table that looks pretty good, and they want multiplayer, so let's do it. So yeah, that was part of the negotiations with them. It obviously caused more time to make the game. And I think even though we were pessimistic about it, and we never did it before because we were pessimistic about it, it still exceeded my expectations of the costs, right? Like it's really, multiplayer is not an easy thing to do. I mean, some of the game engines have middleware or whatever built in that simplifies things a lot. When you're building it from scratch, it's pretty complicated, and also your testing needs go way up. Like you have to test the whole game in multiplayer. So you need to do that. You need 2 QA people, not just 1 QA person, right? So, and we also shipped on Steam, so now we have the Steam game, but the Steam multiplayer game, the Xbox. Well, it's not just Xbox. It's like Windows 10, Xbox, Xbox One, Xbox Series X. So, and on the Xbox side, you can play between Windows 10 and Xbox. You can play between the 2 different types of Xbox. So, like you have all these different. It's really
which is fun as a consumer, but then when you think about it on the other side of things, and you're like that, like, crossplay like that isn't just flicking a switch. So, yeah,
and it can be even more complex, right? Like, we want to have multiplayer, like some games like Fortnite or Rocket League, you can play, one person's on Switch, one person's on PC, one person's on Xbox. That's the next level. We didn't go near that. But
cross-platform,
cross-platform is like the ultimate version of this. But we did it within at least within the Xbox ecosystem. We did that, and anyway, so that's a little tangent. But back to the Game Pass deal. Why did we do it? Well, a couple of reasons. It's because it's the same reason we kind of took the pub fund deals. It's to alleviate risk. So for this project, we got some funding to do some prototyping from Ontario Creates, and some funding up front as well for the full project. We got the first year of development from a publisher, but the game ultimately the game took 3 years total to build this game. So that's, and our team fluctuates kind of like, but I guess our average is like 20 people for 3 years. It's a pretty big expense. So with Game Pass, once you release the game, you get like a large amount of cash. So and it's not like the pub fund. It's not recoupable, right? Because a lot of people are getting your game for free. So so there's the financial risk aspect of it, and then there's also like on the other side, it's like the exposure. Like a lot of people are going to play our game and learn about Drinkbox and hopefully become fans of Drinkbox, because they've tried this game that they got for free that they wouldn't have paid for otherwise, right? So, and then the Microsoft teams, they also promote the game, right? They include it in their shows. We did an announcement at Microsoft events. They're putting in the material, so we're getting like marketing stuff on that side as well. So I mean, like I don't think it's not like a no-brainer to do Game Pass. It really depends on all the details of your agreements, right? Like I'm sure they could have offered us a figure that we would have just said no, that doesn't make any sense, right? But but I do feel like the deal was quite generous, and we were really happy with it. I think both sides ended up being happy with how it all turned out. Yeah.
That's just something for me, like as a consumer, like to me, Game Pass is the best deal in gaming, right? So like that's just, of course, like the way I look at it. But you see, like there's other Ontario indies that are on there, and there's a ton of exposure. But I'm just always curious of the kind of the behind the scenes. Of course, no numbers or anything like that, but just how it benefits developers besides just the exposure side of things. So I really do appreciate that detailed answer, just for my own benefit, but mostly for listeners and people that are also looking to do the same thing, that are maybe looking for a publisher and thinking maybe Game Pass is the route, because that seems to be a bit of an investment, not just in the game, but kind of in your studio and your studio's future, of how to get the brand out there as much as you possibly can. It's all about exposure at that point. And like you were saying, in the conferences and in the Xbox talks, it really helps with the promotion.
Mm-hmm. Totally, yeah. And I could see some people looking at like, how many people got my game and how much did I get? And you do that division and you're like, that's not very much per copy, right? But you can't really think of it like that, because you don't know how many of those people would have actually bought your game, right? It's probably a small fraction, because I think most people on Xbox or most people who play their Xbox regularly are going to have Game Pass. And and there's a lot of Xboxes out there. So a lot of people have Game Pass, and so a lot of people are going to play your game. Right. So that's part of the equation for sure when you're making that decision.
So Drinkbox is almost 14 years old at this point, which
yes,
that must feel crazy. And we have enough, like a certain amount of certified bangers on your resume already. So what's next for the studio in a broad sense? Like, you've already tackled 2D platforming, first person action, and now mastered and coined the isometric dungeon crawling form shifting RPG genre. So where do you go from here, just in a philosophical sense? What do you think is next? Or is there a brand new challenge? Is there something that you want to refine?
Yeah.
General sense. I'm not asking about the future projects.
Yeah. Nobody Saves the World. We're very happy with the reception of Nobody Saves the World. It's been very successful on Game Pass. It's been very successful on Steam, and so we're looking at that, and we're analyzing what is it about this one that really resonated with people. And in parallel to that, we're also doing our brainstorming thing. We've had lots of pitches. I've probably 100 pitches from the team, and multiple rounds of feedback and voting. Like, the team goes through all the pitches and it scores everything, and we take it. So it just helps us prioritize, like, which ones of these do we want to try and drill into more. So we're currently in that Frankensteining process right now, and trying to pull the gem ideas out of the things and right now it looks like it's still pretty early on, because we're working on other stuff. We're talking about possible supporting content, or DLC for Nobody Saves the World, and possibly other platform stuff. But we can't really talk about that stuff. But in terms of like the next game, it feels like there's more than one game that's kind of coming out of this process, at least in my mind right now. It's still pretty early, because like it feels like this and this and this kind of fit together, and this over here, these kind of fit together, and so that, we're going to continue doing that and trying to flesh those out. I think once we have like a very loose idea of these little possible games, we might take those back to the team and be like, let's brainstorm around these a little bit more, make more pitches, refine that. And so it's still pretty early on. We're not entering pre-production into the next game or anything yet. But we're thinking about next ideas, and there's some cool stuff. So I hope we can. And so once we flesh those out, we'll bring them to publishers and do the whole thing again. And probably won't hear what this game is for a couple of years, but yeah.
I'm looking forward to, personally. I'm still not done with Nobody Saves the World, but I can't wait to see what you guys are going to do next. So I think that actually might be the perfect way to close out the show. So do you have any final words, Graham?
Not really, but just thanks very much, Scott, for having me on. It's a pleasure. Yeah.
Graham, thank you very much for joining us. This is episode 7 of the Lodgge podcast. Everybody go get Nobody Saves the World on Xbox and Steam, and keep a lookout for the future of all the crazy things that Drinkbox is going to be up to next. So thank you all, and take care.